No emulators were used in the production of this podcast. That's awesome, sweetie. Thank you. Welcome to the Atari Jaguar Game by Game podcast. It's the show where we talk about Atari's last video game console and its software library, one game at a time. Whether you're a hater or a fanboy, intellectually curious or morbidly curious, I'm glad you're here. I am your host for this episode. They call me Shinto. Well, because I asked them to. This is the obligatory introduction episode where I talk about the show's format, its inspiration, its ambitions, what you will hear and what you will not hear. A little bit about me. I've been a fan of Atari since 1982. It largely defined my childhood. A fan of Linux since 1995, which largely defined my career. A husband since 2000 and a father since 2005. These last two really define who I am as a person today and will always, always supersede the first two. You know, Phil, the no-swear gamer, always says to keep first things first, and that's good advice. For me, that's being a father and a husband. It's my purpose. So that's me in a nutshell. It's a bit vague, I know, but specifics will come out in the stories I tell as we go along. For several years now, I've been listening to an excellent podcast called The Retroist, and one of the great things about his show is how he would always preface each episode with a personal anecdote involving that particular show's topic. That's always impressed me, and I would think to myself, man, I wish I could remember things about stuff. Which is almost a Futurama reference.
Ah, the Breakfast Club soundtrack. Man, I can't wait till I'm old enough to feel ways about stuff.
Yeah, my internal dialogue often includes quotes from Futurama. So then a new podcast comes out called the Atari 2600 Game by Game podcast, hosted by some guy named Ferg. Now, Ferg actively encourages listeners to send in feedback about the games he covers. Back then, off the top of my head, I could think of 3, maybe 4 games that evoked memories I could share on his show. But a funny thing happened. Since he announces games in advance, it struck me, as I looked at the game titles for upcoming episodes, that if I happened to have played them at all as a kid, just looking at the title evoked memories. And remember, Atari largely defined my childhood, so there were a lot of memories bubbling back to the surface. I started recording them and sending them in, where they were graciously received. It turns out I do remember things about stuff, just kind of need a catalyst, a nucleation point, if you will. I really enjoyed recording and sending in my memories, and then Phil, the no-swear gamer I mentioned before, started the Atari 7800 Game by Game podcast, followed by Willie and RK launching the Atari 5200 Super podcast. Both of these shows solicit contributions from listeners, and I've sent in my fair share. I've realized that this is a lot of fun, and maybe I'd like to, start my own podcast. The response I've gotten from the hosts of these shows has been instrumental in this decision. Their kind words are why I'm here now. But which topic should I cover? I love the game-by-game formats that Ferg pioneered, so I figured I'd like to do a similar thing, but at the other end of the Atari gaming spectrum, the Atari Jaguar. The 4 podcasts I've already mentioned here are obvious influences on the show, but a few others unknowingly offered inspiration, and these include the Retrobits podcast by Earl Evans, Wade's Inverse ATASCII podcast, and Rob's Player Missile podcast, these latter two being based around Atari's line of 8-bit computers. This will be a monologue-based show with a single lowly host, that's me, rambling on about Atari Jaguar stuff. I'm not ruling out co-hosts at this point, but I'm not ruling it in either. I like the monologue format. It's generally shorter and to the point. There are many great retro gaming podcasts out there. I listed off a few just now, and here you are investing your time in this one. That means a lot to me, so I want to do my best to maximize content per minute. I do intend to solicit listener feedback about prior shows and especially upcoming shows, much like how Ferg and Phil and RK and Willie do with their respective game-by-game podcasts. It's really cool to learn about a game and then immediately hear other people weigh in with their own opinions and memories about that game. I understand that the Jaguar was not nearly as popular as some of Atari's other systems, like the 2600 and 7800 and 5200 and Lynx and 8-bit computers and 16-bit computers and maybe even the Portfolio, and therefore feedback might be harder to come by, so that's kind of a caveat going in. Or is it a benefit? Hey Jaguar owners, is your feedback getting lost in the long feedback sections of some other podcasts covering more popular video game consoles? Well then, send in some text or audio submissions to the Atari Jaguar Game by Game podcast. Details coming up. I plan to cover one game per episode. The Jaguar's game library is relatively modest, so why rush it? There will also be separate episodes for hardware, at least one for the Jaguar console itself and one for the CD expansion. A separate episode for unreleased hardware is a distinct possibility, and perhaps kind of a denouement describing Jaguar's ultimate fate. And that could be followed by homebrew games. Some of the recent homebrew activity is pretty exciting. So we'll see when we get there. At a minimum, I'm going to be covering games released during the Jaguar's lifespan. I own most of the Jaguar's library, but almost none of the late releases from companies like Telegames and Songbird. So that could make those difficult to review. I'm going for a part number / chronological approach. So being that these are late releases, I'll, worry about that later. My goal is to release episodes bi-weekly. That's every 2 weeks. If it were twice a week, they would be called semi-weekly. One could also say fortnightly, which I frankly find charming. I'll announce on Twitter and or Facebook and or Atari Age when I'm planning on recording the next episode and what the episode will cover so that you'll know pretty much how long you can procrastinate in sending in feedback. I love it when other podcasts do that. It helps me procrastinate myself. You can't be an efficient procrastinator without the deadline in place. In each episode, I will talk about the game's premise, its developers and history, as I can best determine, the gameplay, graphics, sound, where you can buy these games and how much you can expect to pay, my impressions and memories followed by your, hint hint, impressions and memories. I'm also planning on totally stealing Phil's rating system for games, where each game could be rated Hall of Fame for the top 5 games on the platform, Solid for games that are good but not the best, Meh for games which are okay but not that great, and Trash for the bottom 5 games on the platform. I will rate the games on that scale and invite you, my valued listeners, to do the same. Like most other retro gaming podcasts, I have a computer voice. It, seemed the trendy thing to do. Bishop, say hello to the podcast listeners.
Hello to the podcast listeners.
I don't know how or when Bishop will be used, so we'll see. I just wanted to fit in. What you will not hear in this podcast is foul language. I want this to be a family-friendly show so that my kids can listen to it if they really want to. So there's going to be no swearing, no crude innuendo or hate speak in general, at least not for me. Another thing you will not hear in this podcast is the phrase back in the day from this point forward, and you can thank Ferg for that. I used to use that phrase all the time, but he somehow turned me off of it. It's weird how pet peeves can be contagious like that. You know what? Here's an experiment. It really bothers me when people drive with their windshield wipers moving at the top speed when weather conditions do not require it. A slight drizzle or fog does not necessitate the maximum wiper speed. Let that sink in, keep an eye out, and see if it doesn't start to annoy you as well. You can thank me later. Or not. The music for this podcast was written by, me. I used to write a lot of music, primarily and coincidentally during the Jaguar's lifespan, but I haven't written more than a few bars in 15 years. So with that in mind, I think it turned out okay. There's a lot of great music to be found in the Jaguar's game library, but I think it would have been a cop-out to just use one of those tunes. I wanted to have something that tied into the Atari jingle, the Have You Played Atari Today?, a form of which is used in the Jaguar's boot sequence, so what I put together is very jingle-centric. The sound clips are all from Jaguar games, some of which you may not recognize, not yet at least. As I progress through this podcast, I'll have an increasing library of sounds lifted from Jaguar games, but for now, just starting out, I pulled these clips from the good old JaguSounds webpage. This page has been up for about 2 decades, so I'd like to thank Kevin Mann and Wes Powell and the fine folks at Atari.org for keeping it alive. Came in handy. I don't claim to have any unique qualification for doing this podcast. I haven't written a line of code for the Jaguar, though that is on my to-do list. Maybe even more than one line. And while I do have a technical background, I'm sure to get some things wrong here, so please keep me honest If I get something egregiously wrong that makes you yell at your MP3 player, please let me know so that I can issue a correction. I promise I won't go trolling for feedback that way. Well, the Jaguar is really just two 32-bit processors running in parallel. No, not doing that. I've followed the Jaguar closely from its announcements through its launch all the way to today. The vast majority of my collection is from retail purchases in the mid-90s, so a lot of my memories will be contemporary with the Jaguar's lifespan. I'll be drawing on research, newspaper articles that I saved for some reason, these memories, and your contributions to help build the story of the Jaguar's birth, life, games, and legacy. The Atari Jaguar is a unique console. It's interesting in its history, its potential, and its distinctive games. I hope you'll join me in learning more about it. Coming up next, episode 1 will be a hardware episode about the Jaguar console from inception to launch. There's a lot of ground to cover there, and I've learned a lot of interesting things researching it, so it should be fun. That's about all I wanted to cover this episode, except for the windshield wiper thing. I threw that in at no extra charge. So let's talk about links. Not the Atari links. Maybe someday, but web links, hyperlinks, as they were once known. I have one, which contains all the show information you need. Many podcasts end with a long list of URLs, Twitter, Facebook apps, that sort of thing, but I didn't want to do that. Everything you need can be found in your favorite web browser by visiting jaguar.gamebygamepodcast.com. And if your favorite web browser happens to be Lynx, the text mode browser, number 1, you're awesome. And number 2, you'll be happy to know that jaguar.gamebygamepodcast.com works there too. I checked. If you have any stories or memories you'd like to share about the Jaguar relevant to its launch or how you came to own one, please send that in as a text or audio submission to the email address listed on the site, which I'll go ahead and read it here because I am just starting out. The email address is jaguar@gamebygamepodcast.com. Until next time, remember that there is a lot of good to be found out there in this world of ours, even with widely ridiculed video game consoles, so do try to keep an open mind and a joyful heart. Thank you for listening. You may have noticed an audio clip in the opening music which is not specifically from a Jaguar game. I guess I'll go ahead and tell you the story behind that. Perhaps the most well-known soundbite from the Atari Jaguar is Skylar saying, "Where did you learn to fly?" in the game Cybermorph. It's even a bit of an internet meme. It has its own entry on knowyourmeme.com. Well, I figured it would have been entirely too predictable to include that in my opening sequence, but it would have been funny if I used the magic of audio editing to convert Skylar's well-known quote to instead say, "Where did you learn to podcast?" That's my best Skylar impersonation, by the way. Skylar does say pod in a couple other places in Cybermorph, but nothing I could convincingly smash together to sound like cast, so rather than have some horribly butchered Skylar speak, I abandoned the effort. My daughter asked if she could lend her voice to the show, and I thought that, hey, if I can't have Skylar do it, how about an adorable 9-year-old instead? I played the Skylar clip for her, she recorded her version of the altered quote, and I put it in the opening music. So, now you know. And knowing is half the battle. Okay, that was predictable.